Sueño en la idea, hombre, sueño en mi libertad. No tengo paciencia para la mierda que no me deja en paz. Lucho por la idea.
You are listening to Community Radio KGNU, and we turn next to the issue of community rights. I have two guests this morning. Thomas Linzey, who is the Executive Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defence Fund and the co-founder of the Democracy School. He'll be in Colorado at several events next week. He is joining us by phone. Good morning, Thomas.
Good morning, Maeve.
Joining us in the studio, we have Merrily Mazza, who is with the Colorado Community Rights Network. They are trying to get a measure on the statewide ballot this November on community rights. Delighted to have you in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning, Maeve.
Well, first of all, Merrily, tell us about what's happening in Colorado. You do have a measure trying to get it on the statewide ballot, so you need to get at least 98,000 verified signatures. I know you have a buffer. The deadline is August. What exactly would this measure be?
This measure ensures and acknowledges, actually it amends the Colorado Constitution, the Bill of Rights section, to ensure and acknowledge the right of local community self-government. Certainly, as we've seen in the 5 communities that passed issues related to fracking, they were overturned, at least Longmont and Fort Collins, by the Colorado Supreme Court. So what we've discovered and what people in these communities have discovered is that the system is definitely rigged. The lobbyists write the laws, the legislature passes them, and the state enforces them. And that leaves communities with no place to go. So the only alternative we have at this point is to amend the Colorado Constitution.
We'll get into a little bit more details on that and what that measure actually means in just a few minutes. But Thomas Linzey, can I just get your initial reaction to recent events here around oil and gas? Because community rights is not just about oil and gas activity, it's about a whole lot of other things. But this does tie in very much with efforts here to regulate oil and gas activity. And as Merrily said, the Colorado Supreme Court recently overturned the Longmont voter-approved fracking ban. How does that tie in with what you're doing nationally with community rights and what's happening here in the state?
Well, Maeve, when courts issue those kinds of rulings, it doesn't come as a surprise because the system has been structured to guarantee those types of rulings. And so just like, community rights issues are not unique to Colorado. In other words, New Hampshire, you have issues with corporations trying to bottle water, take water from aquifers to bottle and sell overseas. In Ohio, you have issues with fracking and frack wastewater injection wells. In Pennsylvania, it's the same. In other states, you have issues with genetically modified seeds. In other words, anything the community wants to see from a sustainability standpoint generally comes into conflict with the wants and needs of the corporations that are attempting to either extract resources from the community or use it for other reasons. So what's happening in Colorado is certainly not unique. It's an American system of law that we're facing. It's a U.S. system of law that we're facing, which in Colorado has guaranteed that no matter what communities do on the ground to adopt laws, in this case banning fracking or banning oil and gas extraction, that they run headlong against a system that allows the state to actually tell what communities, what they can and cannot do within their own communities and neighborhoods. And so it's an inherently anti-democratic system that we have in the United States today. And you see evidence of that when judges and courts overturn laws that communities pass that are actually aimed at protecting communities from the harm that those activities that the corporations are proposing perpetuates in those communities.
Thomas, you have spoken on KGNU before, and we've had other folks from the local community rights movement talking about the history of all of this. You say it's really buried in US law. Could you give our listeners who aren't familiar with the community rights movement a brief history on where all of this is coming from? What are the roots of these efforts to reimpose community rights?
Sure. Well, when communities first face off against corporations coming in to put in unwanted projects in their communities, a lot of people think, well, we live in a democracy, which means our community has the power to actually adopt a law to say no to this project coming in, which is going to harm us. After all, that makes logical sense from what we've learned in kindergarten and grade school and high school about what democracy is supposed to be, which is consent of the governed and majority rules. And so people believe, as we all did, as I did, coming into this field 20 years ago, that when a majority of people within a community actually vote to say we don't want to be drilled, or we don't want to be factory farmed, or we don't want to be landfilled, or we don't want to have toxics dumped in our neighborhood, that they actually have the legal authority to make that stick, that they have the legal authority to decide what happens to their community in the next 20, 40, or 60 years. But the fact of the matter is that they don't. And they don't for reasons related to 4 different legal doctrines that have been concocted over the past 150 years by the very corporations that today benefit from those doctrines. And those doctrines include things like what we've talked about here this morning, like state and federal preemption, that state legislators in capital cities, sometimes very far away from the communities in which their decisions have an impact, can decide whether or not a community can vote to stop something from coming into that particular municipality that would harm the people there. And, preemption itself is not a very democratic tool, and in fact, it's judicially recognized. So it's not like you can look into the Colorado Constitution and find provisions that deal with the supersession of state law over local law. And so the courts have recognized that as a doctrine because the courts generally see municipalities, in other words, the places where we live, as children to the state being the parent, that there's a parent-child relationship between the two, and the parent can tell the child whatever it wants in terms of defining the scope of what that child can and cannot do. And so preemption is just one of the doctrines. What's become sexy, of course, to talk about over the past 5 years or so is something called corporate personhood. In addition to preemption, which allows the state to override the municipality legally and actually mandate certain things coming into the community. You also have corporations with constitutional rights, which means that if a corporation has a permit to frack or a permit to put some other project in, that the corporation itself has a right to put that project in under the law. Because if a local community passes a law that says, no, you can't do that, they're actually taking property from the corporation because the permit that the corporation has is actually property. It's seen as property under law, and the community passing a law is actually taking the property of the corporation without paying the corporation for that property. And so, all to say, over the past 150 years in this country, corporations, the relatively small number of people who run the corporations in this country, have been able to manipulate the judiciary and manipulate case law so that we now have a system of law in the United States which systematically deprives communities like those in Colorado from actually deciding what happens over the next 20, 40, or 60 years in those communities. And although sometimes it's not talked about this way, preemption itself is not just a defensive tool. It's not just something that says, okay, to communities, you can or can't pass certain things. What it does is it mandates certain activities to be driven into communities. It protects and enables those activities. So the corporations in Colorado can't do what they want to do in terms of fracking within communities without the state's help, without the state government's enabling and authorizing of that corporation to do what that corporation wants to do in the community. So it's actually a proactive driving of those unwanted activities into the community. It's a proactive thing. And so when folks in Colorado brought this class action lawsuit that was recently brought against both the Colorado Oil and Gas Association as well as against the state of Colorado, the reason for it is that it's not just the corporations that are the problem. It's the state that's the problem. It's people's own government that's the problem. And because of that, things like the Colorado Constitutional Amendment, which the Colorado Community Rights Network is now running in Colorado and trying to qualify, is absolutely necessary because without changing the state structure, we're on the receiving end not just of corporations that want to come in and run our communities, but we're also up against state governments which enable and authorize the corporations to do what they do. And so all of this means taking a step back and understanding that, like an iceberg, you only see the top 20% of the iceberg, 80% of it's underneath. And so when people say, well, we can just ban X, Y, and Z, and we have the power to do it, What you're not seeing is the 80% of the iceberg is underneath the waterline, which is this 150 years of law in which corporations have manufactured these legal doctrines which govern us every day in our daily lives across the United States, which have to be changed. And the only way to change them is not only to ask judges to change them, but also override the judges by putting in changes to our state constitutions so that the state is no longer able to enable and authorize those corporations to do what they do.
That's Thomas Linzey, who's the Executive Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defence Fund. He's also the co-founder of Democracy School. He is speaking to us here this morning on KGNU. You can see Thomas Linzey in person next week. He'll be at several events around Colorado. Next Wednesday, June 22nd, he'll be in Denver. On Thursday, the 23rd of June, he's in Fort Collins. On Friday, June 24th, he will be in Boulder. And on Saturday, June 25th, he'll be in Colorado Springs. You can find out more at the Colorado Community Rights Network's website, which we will link to. Now, Merrily Mazza joining us in the studio. She is with the Colorado Community Rights Network. And as we have heard, they are trying to get a measure on the statewide ballot in November that would allow communities to have self-governance. There are 4 main provisions on what you're asking people to vote on. Could you talk us through the 4 provisions, Merrily?
Right, and I wish I had this with me. But it ensures the right to local community self-government. It gives communities the right and the ability to say no to corporate projects if that's what they choose to do. The communities, it doesn't ban anything outright. Communities have to make a step, communities meaning a municipality or a county government. Communities have to take a step and make something happen. So nothing happens automatically. It's up to the democratic will of the people. There's also provisions that prevent communities from doing, I guess what people would say to us many times, crazy things, passing sundowner laws, reinstituting slavery. There's a whole provision that says no, communities cannot interfere with fundamental rights that already exist. So those become the floor of fundamental rights, and communities can add to that. So they can't take away rights, fundamental rights of natural persons. And it also addresses the rights of nature, which is an interesting and very interesting concept, and one that's long overdue if we want to deal with climate change and the other issues going on in the world.
So that's giving legal protection to nature, saying that nature actually has legal rights, because this is actually quite an interesting legal concept that's absent very often in different places around the country.
It's very absent. I mean, what it says is that if you own property, whoever owns the most property can destroy the most nature. And that's the system we've got now. And we've got to have an ability to say, no, someone has to be able, a human, natural person, step into the role and protect nature, protect the rights of that ecosystem to thrive and flourish. So there's that ability as well. But again, it relies on the democratic will of people and communities. So it isn't a ban on anything. And in fact, the amendment itself, which you can read on our website, doesn't even use the word fracking, doesn't use the word oil and gas. It refers to the right of local community self-government.
You are in the signature gathering phase. There is that cutoff point in August, and it's quite a high benchmark for a grassroots organisation like yourself, because as we were talking before we came on air, Merrily, it really is volunteers, grassroots. And so we have seen efforts and a potential ballot measure to actually raise the bar even higher. That movement actually called Raise the Bar, that would make it even more difficult for measures like this to get on the statewide ballot and to amend the Constitution. I don't want to veer us off track on this conversation, but what's your reaction to that?
Well, that's interesting because the people financing the Raise the Bar initiative, it sounds very innocuous and let's protect our Constitution, and it's all corporate interests who are financing it. You can see who's financing it by going on the Secretary of State's site and looking up that group. So we have a very grassroots organization of people and communities. I'm from Lafayette. I worked on the ballot initiative in Lafayette. That was a community rights charter amendment. I helped pass it. I ran for city council. I am on the council there. This is a total grassroots effort of volunteers. This is not paid corporate shills putting in money to restrict the ability to amend the Constitution. Isn't that a great thing? Let's prevent communities from doing absolutely anything.
Just as an aside, we will be having a discussion on the Raise the Bar efforts this evening on It's the Economy from 6 to 7. But getting back to the community rights effort, we've talked about what's happening here statewide, but Thomas Linzey, Colorado is not alone. There are many municipalities, like we heard in Lafayette, there were efforts in Boulder to have community rights enacted in local constitutions. What is happening in terms of if we look at a national movement on this?
Well, Maeve, today we have about 200 communities in 10 states that are essentially have done what Lafayette did and passed community rights ordinances. Those communities are also have faced lawsuits. We have a couple communities in Pennsylvania right now which have been sued for trying to stop frack wastewater injection wells from coming into their community. Some of those lawsuits have been lasting 3 years at this point that they've been in litigation, but it's all predictable. It's all according to script. When these lawsuits get filed against communities, we could write them ourselves because they're all boilerplate. They're about using these same doctrines over and over and over again. And it is that cage into which corporations wish to put all communities, which is a box in which they are able to exercise these different doctrines to overturn and override what people within their own municipalities choose to adopt. And so in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, in Oregon, in Washington State, in New Mexico, all of these different places where people in municipalities are beginning to say, well, wait a minute, I thought we controlled the system of law here, and it's time to actually pick some fights in very carefully scripted confrontations between the corporations and the communities. Because by and large, most people in the United States believe that we live in a democracy, and that we, the people, are the we the people of constitutional fame, which actually has all the power. But instead, the calculus has shifted completely upside down, in which when municipalities and communities step forward to say we're not going to allow, Nestle Corporation to take 1 million gallons a day from our aquifer, or people in Tacoma, Washington, who recently are qualifying a ballot initiative that would allow the people to vote on every water withdrawal that is 1 million gallons or more per day within the city of Tacoma, who just got sued last week by corporations and by the Port of Tacoma, who say you don't have the power to actually vote on those things because you don't have the legal authority to do that because you're interfering with corporate rights, you're interfering with preemptive power, all these other things. So the question is, when people say, well, what's the point of passing these things at the community level if they're just going to get challenged? Well, what was the point of 4 African Americans sitting down at the Woolworths counter in the 1960s? People could say the same thing to them. Hey, you're going to sit down, you're going to get arrested, the police are going to haul you out, nothing's going to change. But as we know our history, everything changed. And nothing changes if we just sit back and allow this system of law to operate. We have to step forward. We have to step up. 10,000 communities across the United States have to move forward to actually pick these fights with corporations because in the end, unless people do and unless these communities do, then people continue to believe that we live in a democratic system. And it's not a democratic system. It's the opposite of that. And until we actually step forward, like the Colorado folks are doing through the COCRN and the constitutional amendment, that everything is just assumed to be valid. Everything's just assumed to be democratic. And until these communities, pull the tail on the tiger and actually begin to move forward to say, hey, we have a different vision here, and our vision is different because it's sustainable and it's democratic, and your vision is not, then we're going to continue to go down the hole, which is everything getting worse. By almost every major environmental statistic today, things are worse now than 40 years ago. And corporations and the small number of people that run them will continue to dictate to our communities what they can and cannot do. And I guess to us, that's unacceptable. And the question is, what are we waiting for? Why aren't 600, 700 communities across the state of Colorado stepping up and saying, screw you? We understand where this system of government leads, which is to us being fracked and poisoned and toxics coming in. And it's time to stand up. And if we don't stand up, then we know where it goes. And if we do stand up, we have a chance of stopping it. So it's a pretty simple equation.
Well, Merrily, Mazza, I know that Move to Amend has just come out and endorsed the Colorado community rights efforts. What other support do you have? Because this does seem to tie into a lot of other social justice, economic justice, environmental justice movements.
It is. We've worked with a lot of local organizations as well, including the Bee Movement in Boulder. They've been active in Lafayette as well. They've endorsed it. Josh Fox has also endorsed it just recently. The filmmaker, right, from Gasland, and several other films. So we have a large list, and we have it periodically on our website newsletters that shows the list of endorsers. But basically what we want to say is that we are addressing a problem at the root cause, and that's what I think is driving all the grassroots effort here. And that root cause is to bring the power back and the democracy back to where it belongs, and that is the communities where we live, work, and raise our families.
You are right now in the signature gathering process. You did say that it's very much a grassroots movement. All volunteers. I mean, is this focused on the Front Range, given that you've mentioned a lot of Front Range organisations? It is a statewide effort. So how's the western slope, the other side, and other eastern, plains and the southern part of Colorado? How are organising efforts going in the rest of the state? Well,
there's certainly a smaller population, but we do have volunteers in all parts of the state. We're doing a lot of our signature gathering at local festivals. We were just at the Dolores River Festival in southern Colorado. So, and I will tell people to go to the Colorado Community Rights Network Facebook page, and you'll see our events. We also have a meetup page called Coloradans, COLORADANS, for community rights. That's our issue committee for the ballot initiative. And on that meetup page, we show various festivals where we will have petitioners if people want to sign the petition. They can also contact me directly, and I've asked people to do that. I have no problem with it. My first name is Merrily, just like Merrily We Roll Along, merrily.mazza, M-A-Z-Z-A, at Comcast.net. And I'm happy to talk to anyone and tell you how to sign the petition, how to get involved.
Thomas Linzey, I know you are coming to Colorado. We'll put all of those dates and details at our website. But are you really just focused on working around the country with organisations like the Colorado Community Rights Network and other folks like that? Or is there any effort to have this all changed at a federal level?
Well, we have currently there are 8 entities, 8 statewide organizations like the Colorado Community Rights Network, which are working in their individual states to bring this type of constitutional change to light. In fact, just a couple months ago in New Hampshire, where unlike Colorado, they don't have the opportunity to use initiative to change their state constitution. We had a group of Republicans and Democrats alike, which you don't hear often nowadays, but come together from both sides of the aisle to introduce almost identical legislation to what's being proposed in Colorado around this constitutional amendment. So actually getting a hearing, going through the bill process in New Hampshire, and so stuff is moving different ways in different states. Part of my role is going into these different states and giving public audiences through colleges, universities, different events, perspective on what the community rights movement is and what's happening in the individual states. And then having discussions with some of the groups at the community level who are moving this type of work through. Just a couple of years ago, folks from those 8 community rights networks, those statewide organizations, came together to form a group called the National Community Rights Network, which has now proposed a federal constitutional amendment that is parallel to what's being proposed by the Coloradans through this constitutional amendment process, the signatures that they're gathering now. And so it's very much a local, state, and federal movement at this point in terms of seeking change and forcing change into all of those different levels. And, of course, the federal constitutional amendment would recognize a federal constitutional right to local community self-government, whereas the state constitutional amendments are seeking that to embed that state right to local community self-government within the state constitution.
Well, just expanding it even beyond a national effort, not to get too far off topic, but in our conversations and our debates and discussions around the TPP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this issue of local self-governance has come up time and time again. What's happening nearly at an international level, Thomas Linzey, when we're seeing this type of international trade agreement where corporations and international governments can come in and tell communities what can and cannot happen in their own community?
Yeah, and then from that perspective, the international one, the United States is not unique. So we've been working with other countries, working with people in other countries. The highest we've ever worked is Ecuador, where we worked with the people of Ecuador to help them put rights of nature language into their national constitution back in 2008, actually making Ecuador the first country to transition from a property-based environmental protection system to a rights-based system. But we've worked in Northern Ireland. In Ireland, we have some intensive work happening in Nepal right now. In India, we've assisted with the drafting of some national legislation. Mexico, in Canada, there's a nascent community rights movement working at the community level to ban sludge and pesticide application, those types of things. In Australia, there's a legislation moving in several localities. In the European Union, there's now a proposal to recognize community rights. And so stuff's happening across the board. It's a question of that most countries who were under colonial control, like the United States at one point, have this superimposed preemptive corporate rights system in place that needs to be attacked and dismantled just the same as the United States system needs to be.
That's Thomas Linzey. He's the Executive Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defence Fund. He's also the co-founder of Democracy School. He's going to be speaking at several events in Colorado next week. On Wednesday, June 22nd in Denver at the Lowry Conference Centre. That's in the evening from 6:30 to 8:30. On Thursday, June 23rd, he'll be at the CSU campus in the Behavioural Sciences Building, A101 in Fort Collins. On Friday, June 24th, he'll be in Boulder on the CU Boulder campus at the Eaton Humanities Building, room 250. And on Saturday, June 25th, he'll be in Colorado Springs at the Penrose Library. We'll put all of that information at kgnu.org. And I know there's also information at the Colorado Community Rights Network, COCRN.org. Merrily, Mazza with the Colorado Community Rights Network. Any final comments now? As I said, you are in the signature gathering phase. You've got 100,000 plus signatures to gather by August. Are you confident that this is going to happen for you?
We are certainly hope so. We have an amazing group of grassroots organizers and volunteers. They're just phenomenal. And these are not paid petitioners. We don't have the money to do that. So it's people who are really motivated and really dedicated. They have been phenomenal. And so our hope is that, yes, this will go through and end up on the ballot. That's what we plan for. I have to say we will continue moving forward with this as we have been, starting in Lafayette when we did our charter amendment. It's an issue that the time has come. It really has. We have to say the state we do not agree that the state's role is to be an enforcement arm of corporations. Really, the state's role is to protect the people who live here.
Merrily, Mazza with the Colorado Community Rights Network, COCRN.org. They also have a Facebook page. And Thomas Linzey, thank you both very much for being with us on KGNU this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's 9:03. This is KGNU, Boulder, Denver.